Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Esme, and I'm a producer for the How To Academy. And we're joined today by Kathryn Paige Harden. Paige is a professor of psychology at the University of Texas over in Austin, where she's calling from today, which is where she leads the Developmental Behavior Genetics Lab. She's coming online with us today to mark the release of her new book, The Genetic Lottery: Why DNA Matters for Social Equality. Paige's research over the past few years has shown that DNA matters, affecting not just our genetic makeup, but educational and economic success. She'll be sharing with us the latest discoveries in genetic science and challenge us to consider how we can ever be equal in a world where people are born different. Paige is going to present for around 40 minutes, and then I'm going to come back on screen to ask her your questions. So please share any thoughts and queries with us via the Q&A box. We'll get through as many as we can. We love hearing your questions at How To Academy. So without further ado, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Paige Harden.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to share my screen. So today I'm going to be talking about my new book, The Genetic Lottery, and specifically how to make sense of an old field with new technology, genetic research on human life course outcomes. And as we talked about, I'm interested as a psychologist, not just in how people end up in their height and their weight, but how they end up in their personality, how they do in school, their income, the things that really make up our social inequalities and the fabric of our identities. So I want to begin with just some observations about how I got into this field to begin with. I was trained as a developmental clinical psychologist, and at the heart of my research interests lie this question: people's lives turn out differently. Why do people's lives turn out differently? In the 1950s, the biologist Conrad Waddington gave us this image, which he termed the epigenetic landscape. So what we have here is a ball rolling down a hill that's, has hills and valleys, peaks and valleys, and the structure of that landscape governs where that ball ends up at the bottom of the landscape. So what Waddington was interested in was the fate of an individual cell. All the cells in our bodies have the same DNA sequence, but some become liver cells and some become skin cells and some become neurons. How is it that a cell differentiates over the course of its life to have this specialized function within the body? As a psychologist, I'm not interested so much in the fate of individual cells, but in the fate of individual people. And we can think of this epigenetic landscape as being a really interesting visual metaphor for the study of how people's lives end up differently. So at the very top of the hill, we have people's starting points in life. And you can think about someone could be, again, at any sort of point along the top of that landscape. At the same time, we have the structure of the landscape. At what point do paths diverge? And once paths have diverged, how difficult is it to kind of jump the track? How deep are the valleys? How deep are the grooves? And then we can look at the end of life. As people are adults or advancing to old age, how do people's lives end up differently? So these questions, how do the structures of our societies shape how people's lives go differently, go hand in hand with the question that I'm often interested in, which is how do people's starting points in life shape how their lives proceed? Increasingly, in both the US and in the UK, we can think about the different ways that people's lives go differently, and we can think about three general domains. The first domain is we can think about material goods. How much money do you make? How much stuff do you have? How much material resources do you have at your command? And in the US, increasingly so, but this is certainly not limited to the US, we have a widening gap between people who have a college degree and people who don't have a college degree in the material goods they have in their possession. So what I'm showing you here are the rise in wages for men in the US at various levels of education. And what you can see is that men without a college degree in the US have essentially experienced no real gain in wages since the 1960s. So the economic gap between the educated and the less educated is big and getting bigger. At the same time, we also see that education matters not just for material goods, but also for physical health. So what I'm showing you here is a graph showing the rise in midlife mortality amongst a certain sector of the population, and this is whites without a college degree. The red line that's increasing most sharply is the US. I've also marked with a star where the UK is in this. And what we can see is that people without a college education, particularly white men without a college education, are living shorter lives. And this is even before the COVID pandemic. In the UK, there's recent data about death from COVID, and you can see that on the bottom hand, there's real occupational stratification in this. And I don't think this is a surprise to any of our listeners. People who are working in elementary occupations, so more routine manual tasks, machine operations, customer service operations, are more likely to have died from COVID compared to people who are in occupations that require more higher education. It's not just physical health. We can also see a widening gap between the educated and the less educated, between people who make more or less money, in not just their physical health, but also their psychological well-being. So this is recent data from the Proceedings of National Academies of Sciences, where they're showing that people who make more money report greater subjective well-being, greater happiness. And we see this in looking at the physical health data. The leading causes of death are often what people call deaths of despair. So deaths from opioid drug overdoses, alcoholism, suicide, self-harm, self-injury. So what we have today in both the US, but also other high-income countries, including the UK, is a situation in which people's lives end up differently, and those differences are increasingly bound up with education. People who have a college education make more money, they live longer and healthier lives, and they lead happier lives on average. Perhaps because of this outsized role that education plays in structuring inequalities in life outcomes, a lot of attention has been paid to the fact that people who have different starting points in life differ in their chances of getting an education. So in the UK, we can look at this, for instance, in participation in higher education by family income. These gaps have narrowed over time, but they've certainly not disappeared. Children who come from richer families are more likely to go to university than children that go from poorer families. This is, of course, true in the UK, and it's also true in the US. So if we're looking at recent data from 2020, children from the richest families in the US, 62% of them have attained a university degree, compared to 16% of children from the poorest families in the US. So I want to stop here and just note what we do when we observe these correlations. These are correlations between people's starting points in life and where they end up, in particular, where they end up relative to education. So we observe this correlation, and at the same time, we know that this correlation is not destiny. We know that there's many children from poor families who've gone on to succeed. We can think of examples of rich children who've really struggled in school. We can think about the fact that there's many different mechanisms that go into this correlation. Richer families have access to better prenatal care. Richer families have access to better preschools. Richer families have access to private tutors. It's not just one thing that goes into the advantage that richer children have compared to poorer children in the realm of education. There are many things in that landscape of development that make your starting point in life with regards to your family's income correlated with this ending point. How far have you gone in school? But despite there being this kind of mechanistic complexity, and despite the fact that this correlation is not destiny, this correlation between people's starting points in life and their ending points in life, we think of as both scientifically and politically relevant. Scientifically relevant because it would be very difficult to do research on how to improve children's education if we did not take into account the fact that they were born into families with different levels of resources and advantages. And it's politically relevant because for many people, the line they draw between fair and unfair inequality is whether or not that inequality can be traced back to these starting points in life. We think of a society as more unfair to the extent that your life chances are structured by the starting point over which you had no control. So with that as a background, I want to introduce or have you think about the fact that we can measure another aspect of where people begin in their life, not just the level of material resources their family has when they're born, but also their DNA sequence, which is fixed at the moment of their conception. Typically, when scientists such as myself are studying genetic differences, we're doing it in the context of what's called a genome-wide association study. So a genome-wide association study is measuring hundreds of thousands or even millions of DNA differences that exist between people. All of our DNA is made up of 4 letters, G, C, T, and A. And one type of DNA difference between people is what's called a SNP, a single nucleotide polymorphism, which is where people differ in just one of those DNA letters. I have a G in a certain point, whereas you might have a T there. So what we can do is we can measure, again, millions of these DNA letter differences between people and correlate them with some outcome that we've measured in the people. So for instance, if I were doing a genome-wide association study of height, I would look to see which DNA letters are more common in taller people versus shorter people. If I was doing a GWAS of body mass index, I would look to see which genetic variants are more common in heavier people versus thinner people. In this case, we're often doing a GWAS of some sort of psychological, behavioral, social trait. Which DNA variants are more common in people who've gone further in school versus people who, say, dropped out before they got their high school diploma? Again, these are correlations, but they're meaningful correlations. So I've done a large GWAS study. I've measured DNA variants in millions of people, and I've identified a set of genetic variants that are more common in people who, let's go with the example of education, have gone further in school. I can then take that information and apply it to a new group of people, essentially as a kind of scoring algorithm to add up information about this new groups of people DNA into a single number. So to go back to the example of height, I've done a large GWAS of height. I've identified which genetic variants are more common in tall people. And then I go to a new group of people and I say, how many height increasing variants do these new people have? And I can end up with a single number that people call a polygenic index or a polygenic score, which represents researchers' best guess. And often that guess isn't very good. There's a lot of uncertainty there, but our best guess about the likelihood of showing a trait based just on people's genetic information. So why am I telling you about polygenic scores? Because recently scientists have developed polygenic scores that are as predictive of major social inequalities as are the variables that we traditionally consider, such as family income. So what I'm showing you here on the left-hand side is data that I've already shown you, and this is educational inequality, rates of college completion by a child's family income. And on the right-hand side of the graph, I'm showing you what are the inequalities in education, not by one measure of starting point, which is the child's family income, but by this other measure of starting point. What DNA variants do they have in the form of a polygenic score? And what you can see in a US context is that the educational disparities we see by measured DNA are nearly as strong as the educational disparities that we see by family income. This isn't limited to just the US. We can also look at this in a UK context. So here we're looking at, this graph is pulled from a paper by Robert Plomin and his colleagues. They're looking at standardized test scores at age 16. I guess this is your school leaving scores. And you have what they call a GPS, and we often call a PGS, a polygenic score. And they're looking at what are the exam scores by deciles. So lowest 10% up to highest 10% of the poorest to richest. So this is socioeconomic status. And of the lowest polygenic score to the highest polygenic score. And it's a very similar story as we see in the US context, where the socioeconomic disparities in exam scores are as large as the genetically associated disparities in exam scores. Going back to the United States, we can look at this earlier in someone's educational trajectory. So my colleagues and I looked at this in relationship to math course taking. What I have here is which math course students take in the 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade, and then their subsequent educational attainment. The math classes are ordered in terms of difficulty and number of prerequisites, ranging from no math up to calculus, which is most often in an American context, the most advanced mathematics class that you can take. The width of the rivers is the number of students who have taken this educational trajectory. The color of the river is a student's polygenic score. So what we can see is that as early as the 9th grade, we already see evidence of these genetically associated educational inequalities, where students with a higher polygenic score are more likely to be tracked into more advanced math classes and more likely to persist in math over the course of the years. We had access to students' transcripts for this study, and a polygenic score predicted whether or not a student would persist in math even above and beyond their observed grades in the previous year. So amongst two students who were in the same school, who were equated for family background, who both had B's in the class, a polygenic score still predicted which one of those students would persist in math for the next year. It's not just education that genetics is relevant for. I was trained as a clinical psychologist, and my colleagues and I have recently turned our attention to what's often in psychiatry called externalizing psychopathology, which is a cluster of disorders of childhood, such as ADHD or oppositional defiant disorder, and then risk for adult addictive disorders. We pool GWAS data on a wide variety of traits that are relevant to externalizing pathology. And in so doing, developed a polygenic score that predicted, amongst other things, the likelihood of developing an alcohol use disorder, the likelihood of having contact with the criminal justice system, ever having used opioids, which, as you might know, is a topic of immense concern in the US landscape right now. We then took that information into medical records, and we found that that polygenic score was significantly associated with biomedical conditions that affect nearly every aspect of the human body. So this polygenic score wasn't just relevant for your likelihood of developing depression or addiction, but also things like HIV infection, whether or not you've ever gotten a skeletal injury to the face, whether or not you've ever developed lung cancer or bronchitis. The line between behavioral genetics and medical genetics is vanishingly thin. Okay, so we can measure an aspect of a child's starting point in life, which is their DNA. And the availability of large-scale genetic data, and the UK Biobank has been absolutely critical for this work around the world, has shown us that we can identify genetic variants that capture a really meaningful amount of variance in social inequalities that we care about, whether or not people finish college, people's biomedical health conditions, whether or not people become addicted, whether or not they have contact with the criminal justice system. But I think it's really important that we do not interpret these DNA measures as purely telling us something about someone's biology, because somewhat counterintuitively, genetic data can also tell us about the environment.